My name is Carter West, and I work for the Goethe-Institut Toronto. And today we're joined by Carole Angier, who's written the book Speak Silence in Search of W.G. Sebald. She's here to speak to us today about the late author's work. On December 9th, it will be the 20th anniversary of his death. Is that correct?
14th.
On the 14th.
Yeah.
I'm very excited to speak to you about this book and about Sebald. If you want to talk about what first drew you to the author and how this sort of much longer, grander project came about.
Yes, well, I was first drawn to him in the way that I'm drawn to all my subjects, which is by reading him. When The Emigrants was published in England, that was not his first book, not his first prose book, his second, but was the first to be translated to English. So when that was published in 1996, it was sent to me to review. And I hadn't, to tell the truth, heard of W.G. Sebald. And it was a sort of job. And I thought, okay, here's this book to review. And I opened it up and I started to read it. And after about a page, I was absolutely, transfigured or transfixed, both of those. And I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was so beautiful. It was so strange. It was so unusual, so unique, really. Anyway, I read the whole thing. I read the whole thing in one go, really. It's 4 short stories, as people will know, but I read them all together. And that was my introduction. I just thought it was the most extraordinary, exquisite, and moving and strange, writing I had come across. And I still think that that's true, particularly perhaps in the English versions. I mean, I don't know whether it's too early to talk about this, but I think that we are very lucky as Anglophone speakers, as English speakers, to have a language that to read Sebald in a language which is effectively his own. German was his own language, of course, and he wrote always in German, and so German readers have the original Sebald. But Sebald worked on because he lived in England for 40 years and spoke perfect English, he oversaw his English translations, and he actually rewrote certainly the first 3 of his books that were translated. He rewrote practically every line. He treated his translators' translations, or particularly his first translator, as drafts. So he effectively wrote. The final version that we get is Sebald's own language. And it's a strange and unique language. It's not normal English.
Right. And the French translation is also quite celebrated as well, certainly of The Emigrants. I wonder if there's something, have you read Sebald in the original German?
Yes.
Is there something within that language and sort of I don't know if the DNA is too scientific a term for it, that sort of makes it so accessible for translators to somehow provide something that is unique in the language that it's being translated to?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I mean, his original German, of course, has all the same qualities. I mean, the extraordinary, kind of swelling, rising, the long sentences that sort of lift up in a sort of spiraling way. And it has all the beauties of descriptions and has all the moving characters, of course. But I think that in Germany, he has really up to the present day, although he's much more recognized than he used to be, but I think he's still less loved and admired in Germany than he is abroad, particularly in the Anglophone world. And I think part of that has to do with the German that he writes, which is, is a very kind of antiquated old German, very formal. And these long sentences, I think modern German is written much more, like English, really, much shorter sentences. He's gone to a very old-fashioned way of writing German. And I think that certainly for a long time, and to some extent still, German readers think, well, this is just old-fashioned stuff. They don't quite get, they think we haven't written like this for a very long time. Whereas English readers are coming across something which is unlike anything else, really. if it's like anything, it's rather like one of his great heroes, Thomas Browne, who is the great, presides over the rings of Saturn, sort of brackets the rings of Saturn. And in the 17th century, there was this kind of meandering, very reflective, very rolling way of writing that, we haven't had here since then. So to the English reader, and I think that somehow, and whether, to some extent, he did also work on his French translations. He spoke French too extremely well. But I believe that less than on his English translations. He worked incredibly hard on his English translations. So whether there's something in the German which lends it to other languages even more than to German itself, when you reproduce the kind of sound of German, the construction of German sentences to some extent, which is what he does when he re-Sebaldized his English translations. He did that. He turned them slightly more into a German sounding sentence, which is what he heard in his own head. So perhaps doing that in another language creates this strange, unusual, magical kind of sound. Whereas in German, it's just perhaps to some extent more of a normal sound.
Right. I know that there's also that discussion with writers like Conrad and even Coetzee, that because they're not writing in their original language, there's something of a kind of void at the center of it that makes it very compelling. And I wonder if that's sort of something similar going on in English translations. I mean, obviously his champions in the English-speaking world were sort of early, and they were quite large figures. Susan Sontag, speaking very kind of eloquently about him early on. But I wonder also, this is perhaps too great an accusation to level, but the lack of reception for him in Germany, or the quieter one, is it perhaps something to do with the sort of memory work that's going on in Sebald in sort of remembering sort of this large project of remembering the victims of the Holocaust, but from a very kind of many refracted lenses, and that though there has been a huge amount of memory work that has gone on for the Shoah in Germany, this kind of remembrance is something that is not, that is still largely silent.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what Sebald does is quite unusual because, again, from that point of view, because, you can't call him a Holocaust writer in any sense, really. I mean, first of all, he doesn't actually write about the victims. He doesn't ever go into a concentration camp. He never describes any atrocities. He never, or even evokes them, really. What he's writing about is the survivors. He's writing about the refugees, isn't he? Especially, in the emigrants and in Austerlitz, and what they've lost. And they've lost their worlds, their families, they've lost everything. And that's what he's writing about. He's not writing about the death of, or the murder of Jews. He's writing about Jewish refugees. And that's pretty unusual, I think. That's a different way of looking at the consequences. And it's a way of looking at how long-term the consequences are. Also because these immigrants or these refugees whom he is writing about are only, it's always towards, they've repressed their memories entirely throughout, as much as they could, throughout the course of their lives. Dr. Selwyn and, Max Ferber and Austerlitz himself, those Jewish refugees from Germany, have hidden their pasts from themselves and repressed them. And it's only over the course of this, when they get very much older, and they're very old, that they can no longer do this, and this memory starts to rise up, and through breakdown, they're forced to really recognize what their pasts were. And that's, I think, again, unusual, and it relates the stories that he tells to far more than the Holocaust. Because as you said early on, his subject is, that is very much his subject, his silent subject, which he never uses the word Holocaust, as we know. He never uses the word Jew or Jewish in any of his works either. But it is very clear. It's always there in the background. We sense it all the time. We know what he means. So, that he is writing about the long-term consequences of the Holocaust, of course, but not only that, that is his tragedy as a German towards the end of the war, whose father fought in that war without question in the German army. But his interest is in wider than that. His interest is in trauma in general and the difficulty of recalling it.
Right.
It's the most important thing to recall, but it's the hardest thing to recall. It's the hardest thing to register at the time.
And he traced that out very well in his biography, that for him, perhaps the sort of originating trauma with his father, certainly the fights that they had when they're younger, but also the death of his grandfather. I mean, that's a very, very moving part early on in the book that sort of traces that out. And yet he never really writes about it except in the sort of first unpublished novel. And then the traces of the sort of sawdust in the coffin are sort of so evocative. But that never sort of surfaces in a published work. And obviously, thanks to you, we now know about it. But I mean, the criticism that I think your book has allowed to resurface or become more vocal is around this notion of sort of appropriating these histories that were, their word is appropriation. I'm not using it as someone who's sort of made a decision about this sort of thing, but characters who perhaps did not have a Jewish past, who he represented in his fictions as Jewish. And I'm curious if, I mean, it seems sort of obvious in a way that, to me, that this is the work of fiction, and so to level a sort of accusation and somehow that this is an unethical move is curious to me. But I'm curious if you have a sort of reaction to those criticisms as they've resurfaced around your work in relation to Sebald.
Well, I certainly do not share and argue in my book against, of course, the notion that in general, he was guilty of appropriating stories that were not his own in order to, because I think this is how the accusation tends to go, in order to lend his work, significance and seriousness and importance and so on. There was a sort of illegitimate parade somehow, of sympathy and so on, really just to attract attention. And that is, I mean, you really need biography to tell you that that's wrong, because you need to know, did the man suffer? Was this a genuine, despair of his for these people? And the answer is yes. I mean, it's very clear throughout his life that the burden he carried of memory and of having to face it all the time, stare at it, like Medusa's head, as he said, was a very heavy one. And he suffered enormously. He suffered in his health. His health was poor. He had several breakdowns in his life. And the first one occurred certainly at the same time as, or very close to, a moment in which he saw a film that was shown at school of the concentration camps. This was, something that was done in Germany, so that people should know what happened. And even though, the theme of my book is very much centered around how that it was not talked about in families privately, that the silence that I mention or that I evoke in my title, is primarily that silence, that in families and even at school up until that late point, he was 17 or 18 years old when that happened, the subject was kept hidden. It was hidden. Nobody would talk about it. It was too difficult to face it. This is, as I say, part of his whole vision, the difficulty of trauma. How do you deal with trauma? And certainly, as a German, he experienced the trauma from that side, as it were, that, just in the way that the children of survivors, on the victim side, also suffered and were traumatized because their parents wouldn't speak and couldn't speak for a long, long, long time. One didn't know, what was this catastrophe that we don't know about? And similarly, the same sort of trauma was experienced on the German side, that this was a huge secret and huge silence. Now I've lost my track. Where was I going?
I guess the question could be around sort of what fiction affords when speaking of these histories that do not lay a claim to sort of total truth, and yet with the sort of photographic evidence that he provides, certainly suggests a sort of strong grounding in reality. And yet it's sort of, we always find, and your biography uncovers that it's sort of adjacent to it in this extremely rich way. And then the other side of that, in sort of Sebald's character and personality, which is also excavated very well, is sort of this trickster-like quality that he had throughout his life, sort of the double Adorno quotation, which in fact was, or the two Adorno letters, which in fact is just coming from one, and his sort of student days. And though this wasn't him, the hamster who had to gain access to one of the student groups that he was part of. I mean, this is sort of wonderful stuff, but then when it's paired with a kind of moving target is certainly not the right word to use, but a sort of shifting relation to truth in these personalities. Is it fair to call that play?
I think it's one of the most difficult things that I wrestled with throughout, writing the book, and to which people have had strong reactions one way or the other, because it is a knot of difficulty, I think. I mean, on the one hand, I think his main aim in inserting those photographs and so on into his stories was to precisely convince his reader of the reality of these stories. These people were real people. He often said in interviews that the photographs were authentic photographs. They were authentic photographs of the characters in the story. And they were authentic photographs most often of the models for those characters. So for example, in particular, Paul Bereiter, the schoolmaster, all of those photographs of Paul are photographs of Sebald's primary school teacher, upon whom the story is based, and very, very closely based. So he did that in order to, I think, reproduce in his reader the experience that he had had, because growing up in Germany, getting more and more worried about what was this past, he was starting to talk with his friends about, what did our fathers do, what in the war, as they grew older, they came to understand that there was what the problem was. And, finally really knowing what the problem was and fighting with his father about it over and over again, as I've told in my biography. Well, as he became clearer about all this, I'm going to lose my track again. I'm trying to head towards something and I've forgotten where I'm heading. He never, it was an abstract worry. It was an abstract worry for him, however painful, and for his whole generation, partly because, or largely because, they rarely met or never met any Jewish people. I mean, there were no Jewish people in the part of southern Bavaria where he was growing up after the war. And this was partly for pretty obvious reasons. I mean, there were no Jews left in Germany, or very few. I mean, they started to come back much, much later, as we know, but there weren't any then. So it was an abstract worry. And it wasn't until he came to England and actually met some Jewish people, mainly, for example, his landlord in Manchester. He came to Manchester, which is a large Jewish population, and his landlord happened to be, as it turned out, a Jewish refugee from Munich. And Munich, of course, is the city closest to which Sebald had grown up in southern Bavaria. So he had this experience of meeting a real person who had grown up in the same place. He'd skied on the same hills. He spoke the same language with the same sound, or similar, because of course Sebald's had some Allgäuerisch sound in it, which you wouldn't have in Munich. But so this was a shock and a revelation. Not that he didn't know all about it and hadn't been worried about it since he was 17 years old or 16 years old, but meeting the real person was the absolute proof or just a confrontation, a revelation to him. And he wanted to recreate that feeling, that encounter in his readers. And I think that's why he put the photographs in. And it works. It works. We feel we know them. We feel we meet them. They're real people. You can look straight into their eyes. But you see, then the trouble is that once you start realizing that this is fiction, which you start to realize pretty soon because of how brilliantly the stories are constructed, and Nabokov could simply not appear in the lives of each of these characters because they span, many years and countries and so on. So you begin to realize that this is fiction and great fiction. And then you start to ask, well, then who are the photographs of, you see? And so there's a kind of a terrible clash or circle that he's caught in, because he both wants to convince you that these are real people by putting the photographs in. And then also by putting the photographs in, he induces a doubt. And it was quite deliberate on his part. He actually said in one interview that he wanted readers to question. He put into Max Ferber, the last story in The Emigrants, he actually puts in this photograph, which is of a book burning in Würzburg. And he says, this is a fake photograph. And we all look at it, it's totally fake. And it's a patently faked photograph. The book burning really happened, but the photograph was fake. So he wants to induce doubt about his methods on the one hand, and on the other hand, he wants to convince us of these terribly important and moving stories, which were, at the center of his own experience in his own life. So it's a trap. It's an insoluble problem, and I think, and if anybody can come up with a solution to it, I would be grateful. I think it's just, he was trying to do two things at the same time, and they didn't always match, didn't fit together very well.
I mean,
in a way, since these are stories about the Holocaust in particular, or about the long-term consequences of the Holocaust, there's a particular problem about introducing doubt about, are these stories true or not? So,
yeah. But it seems as though the porousness that is introduced by the questioning of the methods that are sort of present in the work that we hear in the interviews allows him to take a distance from any sort of ownership of these narratives. The fact that they are sort of, they exist in fiction through his lens, and yet we know they exist in reality on so many other levels. And so we don't just have sort of the memory of Jewish refugees post-1945, and it now is Sebald's possession, but it's sort of regifting it back and allowing an understanding that it is real, but in the way that it happens, it takes many different forms. And
yeah, well, that's a helpful suggestion. Thank you, Carole.
That's
a way of constructing it that helps, I think. And also, of course, as we know, the way the books themselves are constructed is very much through distancing effects. So in other words, the story is always relayed, to the reader through the narrator, who does not possess the story and doesn't, dream of doing anything like that. It's the hero, as it were, who speaks, and he speaks and tells the story to the narrator, and the narrator passes it on to us. So, Sebald referred to this as like periscopic writing. He learned it. He always said, well, he didn't always say, because he said, if I tell people how important Thomas Bernhard has been as an influence on me, nobody will ever forget that. But it's true. Bernhard was a terrific influence, and in that way as well as others. So this periscopic telling, this way in which the narrator sits somewhere, and there's great kind of at a distance vision of what the story is that's being relayed. So distance is essential to. He stands back. He's tactful. He doesn't invade, and he never, I think this is one reason too why there's no dialogue. I mean, open dialogue, normal dialogue. There's a lot of dialogue reported. What people are saying is the whole, essence of the story, but there's no actual dialogue, because he avoids the mimetic. He avoids the dramatic, the dramatizing. It's all distanced in this way, partly to remain at a morally acceptable, respectful distance. He also didn't write dialogue because he couldn't. He said, I'm no good at dialogue, so I don't do it. And that was one reason. But and people sometimes criticize his work, saying that everybody who speaks sounds the same. They are all sounding like Sebald. But that is, of course, at the same time, the spell-binding quality of the books, that they have this Sebaldian sound, that everything moves in the same way, and his reason for it, he said, was, well, the words are always, the subject's words are always interpreted through or heard through the narrator. So of course the form that he gives them is the form we get them in. So that's true, but I think it actually works because it's such a beautiful form.
You have written a very wonderful book, but did so at a slight handicap in that you were not given access to the estate. And I'm curious, or some of the papers from his family, and I'm curious if there's anything more you feel could come to light with access to that, or that those things are sort of better left unsaid, and that a biography can sort of only do so much work in uncovering a person, and then the rest, there is a sort of distance that it too must take, as Sebald did from the subject.
Well, first of all, that's certainly true, Carter. I mean, biographies are written in certain times by certain people. They are as far away from some kind of wholly objective account, even if such a thing is possible, which I don't think it is, as anything could be. My previous subject, Primo Levi, when I published my biography of him, another biography was published of him at the same time. And it was a very good biography as well. It was completely different. Completely different. He had exactly the same, he had interviewed the same people, he had read the same documents, but his interpretations, his was a very historical and factual biography, and mine was a rather concentrated more on the literary side and the psychological side, as I do here as well. And so they were just very, very different. So yes, I think biography is always time bound. It's bound to be superseded because more material will no doubt come to light in one way or another. Documents, letters, will surface. And also just because, different times see things in different ways and different writers write for their times. So it will certainly be superseded. Whether this was in itself such a terrible disadvantage, as many people have said, and which seems pretty obvious to start with, and indeed is of course true. I mean, Max married his wife, Ute, when they were 22 or 3 years old. And 23 years old. He was 23, she was 22. And they were married to the end when he was 57. So I don't know, how's your math? That's a lot of years. And of course, she knew everything about his daily life or a lot about it. But the thing is, I think husbands and wives are not very good witnesses about one another because they have too great an emotional investment and need of one another, So, and of course, the other thing about biography is that I'm not interested really in his daily life as such. I'm interested in his mind, what formed him. So the daily life of his childhood is rather important because that inevitably forms you. But, the inner life of a writer is what I'm interested in all my books. And how much could the daily life, an account of his daily life, help with that? I'm not sure. I don't feel that it was such a disadvantage, really. And I also don't feel that it's likely to change because I think that his wife thought, I'm pretty sure, quite carefully about all this and decided that she didn't wish to partake and was very, consistent. And she's been very consistent both before and after my biography, because even before don't forget that Sebald died 20 years ago. That's why we're celebrating his 20th anniversary. She has never spoken in public. She's never played, the widow at all. She kept herself completely private. And that is her right. And so the fact that she did it with me as well, I suspect that that is her decision. And I would be very surprised if she changed her mind. So I doubt that there will be much more to for anyone. But then I would, wouldn't I? So maybe that's not so.
It brings me to a sort of interesting observation you make, again, fairly early on, about Sebald's relation to sort of women and the sort of lack of real intimacy, save for sort of two examples. And you talk a little bit about his relationship with men and perhaps this sort of fear of homosexuality, which was present early on. And I'm sort of curious how you would imagine, and maybe this is too speculative a question, but in sort of the works that we don't have of Sebald, obviously there were that poetry project with Tripp that was released later, The Unrecounted. But in the works that may have come after that, do you see that there could have been, there are sort of themes in his work that lay underdeveloped that we might have seen from an even more mature Sebald? Or do you think that sort of as Destiny closed out the life so with such a point that December day, that was sort of all we were meant to have? I'm just curious if you sort of.
Well, I think he might have thought that. He was working on something when he died. He'd done a lot of research for it. He hadn't started writing it yet. He was calling it the World War Project. And it was about both world wars, I think. I mean, it started off as being about his parents' generation and how they, could have what their formation was, their emotional formation was, to leave them open to, going along with what happened. So first of all, there was that, and then it was also going to be about the First World War, because as you know from my book, and what makes me argue that the homosexual, because after all, Sebald has been claimed by quite a few, or gay writers or queer writers as a queer writer, looking particularly at all, as you say, the relationships, the feelings for men that are in the books, that his great sympathy and identification and imaginative understanding is often for men and for male writers, of course, all the way through the Rings of Saturn, Edward Fitzgerald and Conrad and, Swinburne and Thomas Browne himself. And obviously the heroes of both the Emigrants and Austerlitz are men. And as you said, there are very few tender relationships between the sexes in his books. As you said, there are a couple, there are two. There's the relationship between Chateaubriand and Charlotte Ives in the Rings of Saturn, which is a tender love story, but a sad one that is unachieved. And then there is the relationship between Paul Beretta and Lucy Landau in The Emigrants, which is again a very tender story, but a very, they're both quite old, they're towards the end of their lives, or anyway, they're older people. And of course, Paul dies at the end of it, although by suicide. So, but anyway, there isn't, and there's very little sex. There's no sex. There's no heterosexual sex except, well, there's no homosexual sex, and there's no heterosexual sex except one or two horrifying episodes. Really, really disturbing episodes. The one in Vertigo, where the young boy, the narrator is a young boy, sees a couple making love. He doesn't really understand what's going on. A couple having sex, I suppose you should say, because it's a little bit cruder than that. And he doesn't really understand what's going on, but it's all quite spooky and terrifying. And he ends up immediately afterwards becoming extremely ill and nearly dying, which is, of course, a kind of, in a literary sense, a sort of a passage from horror or through horror. And also then there is in the Rings of Saturn a terrible scene in which the narrator sees what he calls a sea monster on the sand below, a beach below a cliff, which is a couple obviously making love as well. So there is a terrible kind of, but there isn't just a problem about sex in his books. There's a problem about all appetites. He finds appetite disturbing. So eating, for example, there's some pretty horrible scenes, like an old woman who's eating a slab of meat in some railway restaurant, and then he describes with quite disturbing horror, great fat people with their bellies hanging out over their men, over their belts, and they're always, the idea of eating is also very disturbing to him. He was himself personally a vegetarian. So it extends beyond sex, his unhappiness with physical appetite. And I think that's an interesting, an important part of his makeup, his psychological makeup, and his literary explorations. You know,
Yeah, you said sort of the day to day is what is sort of traumatic for him, you think?
yeah, well, more than day to day, it's yeah, I mean, all experience is traumatic for him anyway. That's what I ended up thinking, you know, that he had a, what, you know, in a way is quite common amongst artists. Of course, it's what makes them, drives them to paint or write, and allows them to see things and portray things that most of us don't, you know, bother to look hard enough or feel hard enough or hear hard enough, listen hard enough to actually perceive or suffer, whereas they do it for us. And that's why we read, I think, fiction and other forms of literature too, nonfiction forms of literature as well, which is to encounter these experiences that we don't have ourselves. So we remain, you know, kind of normal and sane, and our artists very often aren't either normal or sane, certainly not normal. And certainly, I think that's what Sebald was. He was someone on the edge of experience. So whether it's right to just describe him as a very hypersensitive artist, or whatever is the right way of describing it, it's something like that. There was a, you know, an ability or a necessity, something he couldn't help, of exposing himself to extremes of experience that we normally, most people manage to avoid. So, you know, all of his classmates and his sisters and so on, they had to see that same film that was shown in German schools and indeed in German everywhere after the war for some years. And they all, of course, were deeply disturbed by it, but most of them managed to just cope with it, to kind of forget about it, get on with their lives, you know, whereas he was derailed by it to a large extent. Of course, he went on with his life as well. But, and that's what his books are about. His books are about, you know, the horror of life, really. And not just the horror of the Holocaust, but the horror of life.
And do you have any, I mean, he wrote that sort of first novel when he was 22, 23, and then focused very much on poetry. And then we don't really, I mean, he would sort of claim, as you say, falsely, and it seems right, that he didn't start writing until his sort of mid 40s, when that's clearly not the case. But do you find that that period is sort of a time of gathering evidence for Sebald, if that's a way of putting it?
Well, you know, this has to be to some extent speculative because I couldn't ask him. But I think I know from the research that I did that when he was a young, well, first of all, he started writing poetry and writing stories in his school magazines. I mean, when he was 15, 16 years old. So he was always writing something. Of course, he became an academic, so he continued to write, but he was always writing. He continued to write poetry for many years. But the thing was, when he got to his first university, he met very close friends, and they formed a group together of writers, and they decided they wanted to be, each of them wanted to be, all three of them wanted to be the great German writer. And of course, that's exactly what Sebald ended up being. And one of the others ended up being a very, very successful best-selling comic writer in Germany during the 80s and 90s, or during the 90s mostly, like Sebald himself. And the third one became a psychoanalyst. He's the one who's still alive. And because the third one, like Sebald, has already died, and died before I could meet him. But the third one is still alive. He's a psychoanalyst, and he too he's now writing and publishing himself. So all three of them, you know, were going to be great writers. Well, that was when Sebald was 19, 20 years old. So the notion that he didn't intend ever to be a writer is like totally false, you know, provably false, because there's plenty of evidence against it. However, I think what happened was that this is what's speculative, that when he decided, you know, on an academic career, which it took him a while to settle to this, but when he decided to do this, he then became, I mean, he was very practical in those ways. Money was very important to him. Security was important to him. He came from his original family where they weren't wealthy. His father was a soldier, a professional soldier. His mother was a housewife. You know, they were kind of lower middle class, okay, but by no means well off. So it was very important to him always to have security and money. And so I think he just concentrated on his academic career very much. And just went on writing poetry. That was all. Now, why did he then move from that, as it were, dormant period of literary engagement, to actually writing his own literary work? And that happened in the early 80s. He started to publish in the mid 80s. And I believe, from the research that I have done and from everything his friends were able to tell me, and the people close to his life, he had a very important, serious breakdown at that point in his life, when he was 35 years old. And he says in one of his interviews, he says, I thought that I was in control of my life until I was 35 years old. And since then, I haven't been, and he doesn't say anything more about that. He did also say to another interviewer that he'd had a serious midlife crisis, but it was private and he didn't talk about it much. But, my job is to expose him. I'm sorry, but it's important. So I do. And what I believe happened is he had a very serious breakdown, which he explores in his first prose book, which is called Vertigo. Or we call it Vertigo in English. Yeah, Schwindelgefühle, it's called in German. And in it, the narrator is clearly in a very fragile mental state. And a part of it, of course, is also a literary working up of things. So you can't always, you can't go straight from the fiction to the fact, of course. But the narrator in that book does definitely cross a line from neurosis into a psychotic episode. And all my researches showed me that that was true of Sebald as well at that time. And that what he was exploring in that book. And I think that's what tipped him over into writing, because he came back from, typically Sebald, a walking trip that he took, the trip that he describes in Vertigo, walking across, and not just walking, of course, taking trains as well, and so on, across northern Italy and into his own Bavarian Alps and down into his own old village. The book ends with his entering his own old village, W, he calls it, and it was indeed called Wertach. He comes back from that trip and he starts to really write in much more seriously, much more devotedly, and much more internally than he's done before. And it still sticks to poetry at the beginning, and he publishes After Nature, which is an epic poem in the later 80s. But he was also writing other things. He was writing television plays, which is quite surprising, and his poetry and his, and then starting this great prose project, which eventually ended up being both Vertigo and The Emigrants, because he eventually kind of realized that they needed to be split off and treated separately. So that's how his writing began, I think. And he always said that he just turned to writing because he was getting bored with his academic routine and he wanted to find some private place where he could just do what he liked with nobody looking over his shoulder. And that was partly true as well, of course. But the real reason, which he didn't ever admit to, of course, I think, was this terrible crisis and encounter with real emotional, mental stress. And
the number of car accidents throughout in 2000.
He got a car in 1967 when he was 23 years old, and he almost immediately had an accident in it, which was quite a serious one, I think, judging by the amount of money he had to pay to fix the car, which was quite a lot. I've forgotten the exact sum, but it was a lot of money. And he had accidents throughout his life. It's a kind of recurring theme, and I pick it up in my book because not just because it's a fact, but because it's what Virginia Woolf called a fertile fact. It gives you a sense and an insight into the sense that I want to convey when I get to the end of the book, that he had great belief really in fate and destiny, and in a way even almost predestination. And I find this in his own life, particularly in those car accidents, because in that early novel he wrote, which you have already mentioned, there is a car accident. In fact, there are two car accidents. One happens to the narrator's parents, who the mother, they're driving together, and the mother is driving and she doesn't turn the wheel on a curve, and the car goes off a cliff or a mountain road, and they both die. And the narrator suggests that that might have been from a suicidal impulse that the mother had. So there's that. And of course, Sebald's own accident, lost accident, happened rather like that, in the sense that he came onto the main road, there was a curve, and he didn't take it, the car went straight ahead. So, and then there's also an accident in that early novel in which the narrator and his then girlfriend or fiance are driving, and he turns to smile at her, and drives off the road. And this happens right by a white fence. And the fact is that Sebald's last accident happened, the car ended up right by a white fence on the A46 road near Norwich. I've seen it, many people have seen it. And, you can explain it in lots of ways. He was very easily distractible. He lived entirely in his imagination. He couldn't distinguish clearly very often between something that he just remembered or imagined and something that he actually saw. So he said this in interviews, it's hard for me to live a normal life because I can't distinguish often these things. They seem equally present to me. And he would just become so distracted by something that he was thinking or something that he was saying that he would forget he was driving his car, and he would drive into the wrong lane or drive off. This happened many times, several times. I would say, did I count, maybe at least half a dozen, maybe 8 or 10 times during the course of his life. And one of them in 1982 was very similar to the last one, in that he actually had his niece, of whom he was extremely fond, in the car with him, just as he had his daughter in the car in the final accident. And in a similar way, he drove up to the main road, and then turning onto the main road, he made some error of perception or attention, and there was a bad accident then. And the two of them, he and his niece, only just escaped with their lives from that accident. That was in 1982. So there is this constant strange sense, his great theme of coincidence and strange events that occur and that concur, that give us some suggestion of a reality that we don't understand, that is beyond this one. It seemed to me it happened in his own life.
But again, thank you very, very much for this wonderful book. And will it appear in German, do you think?
It definitely will appear in German. Yes, it's being translated at the moment. It will come out next autumn, hopefully. Okay. That's one of the things I'm doing, is talking to the translator and answering questions. And I can't, of course, do in German what Sebald did in English, because my German isn't good enough for that. Right. But it's good enough to, follow what he's doing. And it's fascinating to see it coming out in German. My words being interpreted, coming out in German, it's a fascinating process. Yeah. But my translator is lucky. I'm not Sebald. I can't do that. It'll be his work.
Okay. And he applied for the Goethe-Institut. He wanted to be a language teacher at one point, didn't he?
He applied twice.
Okay.
Twice. Yeah. He was, because he wasn't ever really quite sure where his place was or what he should do. And one of the things is, of course, he was so critical of Germany and of Germans. And that's I think it's difficult for Germans to read him, partly for that reason as well, not just his language and the fact that he reminds them of the past. But his books are full of criticism. Well, not full, but there are criticisms of Germany, particularly of his own hometown. People in his hometown don't appreciate him very much because they feel he didn't appreciate them. And they're not wrong about that. So, this was a difficulty really for him. But on the other hand, he kept trying to go back. He never really stopped trying to go back to Germany. So he applied to the Goethe-Institut twice over the course of his life. And he also applied, when he was in his mid-40s, he finally got his habilitation so that he could teach in German universities. He got it, and he did apply to one or two. I think he tried Wolfsburg, and he applied to a couple of universities in Switzerland. It didn't happen. He stayed in England, but he tried.
Hmm.
So I think, his relationship to Germany was in no way wholly negative. It was a love-hate relationship. It was like the relationship that Paul Berreiter has to Germany. If he's not a German, he doesn't know how to imagine himself.
Right. And what is it, the sort of language that can only speak in German and yet can't express himself that way, and sort of is locked in this?
Well, German was absolutely, I think, German was his real Heimat. I mean, his language was the one place that was his real home. England never became his home, really. He never felt at home here. He never felt he was accepted as being at home here, although, I mean, I think he was. He just had that feeling, He used to say, he'd say where he wanted to go in a bus or something, and the bus conductor would say, pardon, because they wouldn't understand his accent. He did have an accent. He had a strong accent. But I think, anyway, for whatever reason, that among others, he didn't feel at home here. He, of course, didn't feel at home in Germany. He kept wanting to go back, but the moment he went back, he left again. So there was no home for him. And that's partly what we feel. That is what these stories are about as well. He's in an in-between world. He's in the world between the living and the dead. He's in the world, of the hunter Gracchus, really. Someone who wants to die, but can't die. And that you can interpret as wants to go back to Germany, can't go there, wants to come to England, can't go stay here. The
person who goes to the inn and realizes it's a graveyard.
Yeah,
as an Winterreise.
That's right. In the Winterreise, exactly. That's right. That is, very importantly, really right for him. I think, his brother-in-law at his funeral, his brother-in-law, who was a singer, is a singer. Well, was a singer and is a singer. Sang from a song from the Winterreise. That song, the Wirtshaus, for him, and that was right. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very, very much for joining me today, and look forward to whatever comes next. Best of luck for the German translation, and have a lovely evening.
Okay, I'd like to read a bit from towards the end of Austerlitz, when Jacques Austerlitz and his love, Marie, whom he is, of course, going to lose, because this is a, Sebald story, they're in Paris, and they come across this little family circus, and this is what I'd like to read about that, because I think it represents some of Sebald's most beautiful, mysterious, elusive kind of writing. I cannot say what it was that the 5 circus performers played that Saturday afternoon in the circus tent beyond the Gare d'Austerlitz for their tiny audience drawn from heaven knows where, said Austerlitz. But it seemed to me, he added, as if the music came from somewhere very distant. From the east, I thought, from the Caucasus or Turkey. Nor can I say what was suggested to my mind by the sounds produced by the players, none of whom, I'm sure, could read musical notation. Sometimes I seemed to hear a long-forgotten Welsh hymn in their melodies, or then again, very softly, yet making the senses swirl, the revolutions of a waltz, a Ländler theme, or the slow sound of a funeral march, which put me in mind of the curiously halting progress of a uniformed guard of honor, escorting a body to its last resting place, and of how, in their ceremonious manner, they pause every time before taking the next step, with one foot suspended an inch above the ground for the briefest of moments. I still do not understand, said Austerlitz, what was happening within me as I listened to this extraordinarily foreign, nocturnal music, conjured out of the thin air, so to speak, by the circus performers with their slightly out-of-tune instruments. Nor could I have said at the time whether my heart was contracting in pain or expanding with happiness for the first time in my life. Why certain tonal colors, subtlety of key, and syncopations can take such a hold on the mind is something that an entirely unmusical person like myself can never understand, said Austerlitz. But today, looking back, it seems to me as if the mystery which touched me at the time was summoned up in the image of the snow-white goose, standing motionless and steadfast amongst the musicians as long as they played. Neck craning forward slightly, pale eyelids slightly lowered, it listened there in the tent beneath that shimmering firmament of painted stars until the last notes had died away, as if it knew its own future and the fate of its present companions.